Jared, the
Did.
man of the hour. How are you, man?
Um,
So nice to virtually meet you.
Absolutely. I'm great, Daniel. Thanks so much for the invite. I'm glad I connected. It's always nice when technology works the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I know. I've had all sorts of issues, man. Oh, let me tell you, one time I got my keys rattled and he was in his car driving and he passed through an accident. I was like, yo, dude, I think we better do this some other time. So it's nice that technology is upon us. It's time.
It's Out of anybody that could have happened to, Dr. Mike Israetel is the person I would expect it to happen to, or to be able to still continue a coherent conversation while that
Hey,
happens. I helped run a webinar that Clinical Athlete ran a little bit ago, and we had Dr. Mike on. Uh, I had to mute myself most of the webinar because I was just laughing too hard because it was essentially a comedy show as well as being educational.
yeah, I totally understand, man. So thanks to you for taking the time of your busy day. It's really a privilege. I got to know about you and your story through Iron Culture. I was mind blown the whole episode. I was like, oh Jesus Christ, the way that your experience that I'm really excited to talk about can be translated into our own particular issues in regards to life and training as a whole can be of so much insight and can be let's say a love letter to lifting and to it can be life reaffirming. And I wanted to make this discussion a little bit more casual, more about your experience, both in your whole journey through this really odd disease, and not so much about papers, citing papers and discussing papers, because I know although that is really interesting and I'm sure you and I both love that stuff. I think for this time we can go a little bit on that road.
Love it.
Oh,
That sounds awesome to me.
very well, man. So let's dig into this, man. I don't even know where to begin, but I have my keynotes here, of course. The first thing I think it's important for this discussion is to talk about a little bit of your background in lifting, as a powerlifting, your career as a personal training, as a physiotherapist, because then what happens after, I think it makes a lot more sense, right? So can you give us a little bit of your background, Jared?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm Jared Maynard. I'm a registered physiotherapist here in Canada. I live a little west of Toronto, in Ontario. I'm a powerlifter. I'm a strength coach. I'm a co-owner of a company called Rebuild Stronger, which is coaching for people trying to get strong, both competitively in weightlifting, powerlifting, strongman, but also trying to train for strength in life or any other endeavors that way. I'm a speaker, getting more into writing as well. I've got three beautiful young daughters at home and a rock star wife who keeps us all alive somehow. Thank God. Um, and yeah, these are the main hats that I wear these days. So yeah, in terms of maybe where my path began or how I got into the realm of training and physical therapy. I growing up as a kid, I was never very athletic. I was the kid who was staying inside watching TV on beautiful summer days, and my parents just wanted to try to find something that I would do for a sport, some sort of activity, so I'd be outside and like be a little more active. We tried finding a bunch of stuff, and like we tried tennis, we tried basketball. I was terrible at all of them. I didn't enjoy them until kung fu. Like martial arts was the first thing that I gravitated towards. Maybe because I watched a lot of Power Rangers growing up. Maybe I don't know, but did kung fu for about 3 years, and then this took me into beginning high school. So then football, American football, not the actual football, uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, American football was the sport that I got into next. Played that for a number of years, um, or for 3 years, and then transitioning from high school to my university undergrad degree. I needed something to do to stay active because I wasn't on the football field for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. So I had started to lift weights in my parents' basement when I was about 15, 16, trying to get a little bit bigger, a little stronger so that come the next football season, I could be a little stronger and on the football field, not get pushed around so much. Because even though I grew up as a pretty fat, pretty chunky kid, on the football field, I was one of the smaller guys. So trying to be a little bit better able to hold that down was the motivation. And then that just continued on into my undergrad, where I kept training because it was an outlet. It was a bit of an anchor. It was something that gave me, more routine, and it was fun to be able to push myself in the gym, see those developments. Um, and around 2012, so this would have been the end of undergrad into the year between undergrad and physical therapy school. This was also the time when natural bodybuilding was like reaching a renaissance. So I wanted to get into natural bodybuilding, tried to train for that for a number of years. Never competed. I did get relatively lean, but I found that it just wasn't a good fit for me, just with where I was headspace wise and with the season of life. Still have tremendous respect for physique sports, still have a special spot for bodybuilding in my heart, but it just wasn't the thing that I was meant to compete in. And then my rebound, like it felt like I broke up with bodybuilding and I had to find a rebound relationship, and that was powerlifting for me. So 2014 started to get a little bit more into powerlifting training. Really dug it. It fit better for me at the time because it wasn't as subjective as bodybuilding felt. There's still subjectivity in powerlifting. Was that squat to depth or not? You're never going to get away from all of that. But it felt better for me at the time because it was more about, cool, can I just get strong and complete this lift to standard versus, again, for me, getting up on stage and seeing my physique compared to the guy next to me, it just wasn't super awesome. Didn't feel it at the time. So yeah, powerlifting was the thing that I stayed in. Started competing in 2016. I wish I had competed sooner, but I think like a lot of lifters who think about competing in powerlifting, you think you have to be strong enough to compete, and that delayed me starting. But started to compete, competed and trained for a number of years. Started to coach just a couple of friends at the gym, and then that has grown as well. And then to this point, I have coached everyone or coached lifters from total beginners who've never stepped foot in the gym before, to those who are just thinking about powerlifting. I've also coached people up to and through national competitions and world competitions. And with my business partner, John, we have multiple multi-time national champions, world competitors. So it really runs the gamut, both in powerlifting and other strength sports. So that's kind of my athletic track. And then in short version for physical therapy, I thought I wanted to be a doctor in high school. And then I realized how much school is actually required to be a doctor. And I thought, you know what? I don't know if my heart's in it enough. So physical therapy was the next best thing for me. And through physio school, I was pretty sure I wanted to get into sports medicine and orthopedics, and that never really changed. But through school and after school, I realized that there was a big gap between kind of the standard of care and understanding or even knowledge in the clinical world, working with athletes generally, but lifters or strength athletes specifically, where what we were learning in school just was very textbook, like, oh, your knees should never go past your toes, which is outdated and like really needed some more nuance. So then how much more is there? How many more questions are there when you've got someone who's a 700-pound squatter who's got knee pain? You're like, what do I do with this person? So that led me to go try to find people who were working with these people, which led me to my now colleague, Dr. Quinn Hennick, who's a physical therapist, co-founder of Clinical Athlete, of which I'm a part. And it's really led to my current tracks where I work with people entirely digitally. I operate as a coach pretty almost exclusively these days. I still retain my physio license, am still a physio, but really the focus for me is helping people get strong in whatever way matters to them. That was long-winded, but hopefully that gave a good background.
No, no, not at all, man. That's what I'm here for. All the minutiae and the details that get lost in social media. And I can relate to a couple things. The first one is that I was actually never into sports, except perhaps skateboarding. I was brought up in the early 2000s, so Tony Hawk's Pro Skater went full on, and perhaps you can relate to that, man.
Oh,
The punk rock music. Hey,
so
even
much.
even to this day,
Oh,
my man. So
hold on.
skateboarding, I have a zero board.
Uh,
Comes right here.
Hold on. Now I gotta ask, man. Would you, when you were playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and I was big into the first and the second game,
Oh,
Tony
the
Hawk's Pro
second.
Skater 2, second, yeah, there.
I was
Good. We're gonna get along just fine. But who was your choice? Who would you play as mostly?
Rodney Mullen, man.
Oh, you got
And
it. The Godfather.
yeah, of course, man, top legend. And I think it might not seem to the people that's listening, and thank you for joining in. This can tie together because a lot of things in physiotherapy, in your own experience, and the way with the second thing that I can relate to is how you got into lifting. For me, lifting, it was like in the dark, you know, you start lifting in the basement or somewhere where people don't see you because lifting is kind of odd. And either you become at least in Mexico, a bodybuilder that's obviously enhanced because here we, at least to that point, I didn't know that natural bodybuilding existed up until people like Eric Helms and many more. So it was either that route or some other weird route that in Mexico, at least in my own particular scenario, wasn't as usual, like powerlifting. And the way that I think of lifting, as the title implies, nowadays, is that it's a life-assuring activity that should be promoted, that should be talked about in the way that not only to pertaining to bodybuilders, powerlifters, but the elderly, the people that are currently facing a disease, and that's what I love about your story, that can bring light to how lifting, and that's what I wanted to begin with your background, how lifting, in a way, prepared you for what was about to come. That I want, I it up well, I don't want to be so reiterative with your story because I don't know if it's comfortable for you, but just to people to know about the disease and what you had to face, and they can check it in your profile, that I think it's so valuable. How lifting led you to actually recover, and not just recover, but to actually max out your deadlifts and other lifts after all that situation, man. So if you agree, I'd love to hear about your story and how you came to be with this. I'm not even, well, I'm gonna try because it's already hard in Spanish and in English is not my first language,
Sure.
but let me try, man.
Go for it.
What is actually HLH? I have it right here. Hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. Please excuse me if I'm butchering, man. It's so hard already in
That was
Spanish.
one
So,
of the better pronunciations I've heard, honestly.
come on, man. Come
I'm
on,
not
man.
being nice. That was actually pretty good.
You're being nice, man. I know it. So
I mean, I am. I'm
please,
Canadian. I have to be,
yeah,
but you know,
you Canadian
it's
people.
right. So yeah, we'll start with what is HLH. It's a rare disease. It was described to me in the hospital as being autoimmune-ish. It's not a true autoimmune disease. It's technically a hyperinflammatory syndrome. But basically, what happens is the body, the immune cells, histiocytes and lymphocytes in particular, start to attack healthy cells, especially red blood cells in the body. It is fast moving. It's rare. It's quite deadly. And there are two main types, which I'll come back to in a second. But as the immune cells start to attack these healthy cells, it leads to multi-organ failure, and it can be fatal very quickly. Some of the mortality stats that I've seen, on the more generous side, were like 57% of adult cases end in fatality. So, odds not much better than a coin flip. So those two main categories of HLH are primary, which has a genetic component. And if there is a genetic component, that's almost always showing up in newborns and infants, or secondary or adult onset, where there isn't a genetic component, but it can be triggered by either another infection, which was the case for me, which we'll come back to, or some sort of cancer or a different autoimmune disease. And the treatment for both types, primary and secondary, are similar. It involves chemotherapy. It involves corticosteroids. It's a really aggressive battery of things to try to dampen the immune response and stop what's going on, the damage going on to kidneys and spleen and liver. Those are typical, or some of the most affected organs and systems. It can also involve a bone marrow transplant, and that's the key differentiator between primary HLH and secondary, because primary involves the genetic component. You have to have a bone marrow transplant to have a chance of curing it. for me, which again we'll come back to, and for other secondary cases, a bone marrow transplant may be needed, but it's not as necessary as often as it is in primary. So you're exactly right. And for the record, I'm a complete open book with this story, because especially now, as I've talked about it more, thought about it more, I'm more convicted that sharing this story, sharing my story is powerful, and has the potential to hopefully influence a good chunk of people, maybe all at once, but my minimum hope is that it speaks to people individually. And if they need motivation, if they need more reasons why getting strong training is life affirming, life saving, as it was the case for me, I'm hoping this can be the catalyst for it. So going back to January of 2023, my family and I, we'd gone to go see my parents for New Year's Day, had a lovely visit, came back home. The next day I started to feel a little sick. Didn't think too much of it. It was the winter time, it's cold and flu season. So I thought, not a big deal, because my wife and daughter started to get sick too. Fast forward to the end of that week, they were all getting better and I was getting worse actively. So started having fever, chills, started to have insomnia, which was really odd for me because I'd never experienced insomnia before. Had some pressure in my sinuses, which is part of what made us think it was a sinus infection to start. My physician had given me antibiotics and a nasal spray. It wasn't helping. So, a week and a half after that, I was getting worse. My lymph nodes through my neck and my shoulders were really swollen. It felt like running my fingers over little small mountains, like a topographical map is what I thought of when it happened. And the insomnia was getting worse. The fever, chills were getting worse. So we went to a smaller hospital not far from where I live, and they diagnosed me as having mononucleosis, which was strange. I had never had mono before. My wife had never had mono before. I didn't know where I'd gotten it. But with that sort of infection, it runs its course. It's a viral thing. So you can't really do much other than manage symptoms and kind of let it pass. So I was given sleeping medication to help the insomnia, sent back home. 3 days later, my wife is looking at me in the morning because I am just continuing to get worse. And she looks at me and she goes, "You're yellow," because my skin has started to jaundice. So we knew something was wrong as a physio. Not that you need to be a physio, but you recognize if your skin's yellow, there's something wrong with your liver and you got to get checked out for sure. So we went to a larger hospital further away from where I live. And I remember coming out of the car and just like staggering into the emergency department. The nurse who was triaging people, she took my blood pressure and my heart rate. Heart rate was skyrocketing. My blood pressure was spiked. I told the next nurse I was going to pass out, and I almost did. And they admitted me that day. It was the day before my twin girl's fifth birthday, excuse me. And within 6 days of being admitted to the ER, I was in the ICU, intensive care unit, on life support. With multi-organ failure, I needed dialysis for my kidneys. My liver was failing. I had a hugely enlarged spleen, which I found out was the largest lymph node in the body. So my immune system was going absolutely crazy. And through those 6 days, they were running blood test after blood test. We had a lot of different specialties, nephrologists to talk to me about my kidneys. My vision was going dark because I have a separate, unrelated genetic eye condition, but it seemed like everything, if someone had a switch for how bright life is, it's like life was at 50% brightness. And just all sorts of things, trying to take a lot of x-rays, CTs, ultrasounds, trying to figure out what was going on. And finally, we landed on the diagnosis of HLH. And for me, I mentioned with a secondary HLH, it can be caused by an infection mononucleosis is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, which is a particularly sneaky kind of virus where it can lie dormant, as I understand it, for extended periods of time. So you're not always sure where you pick it up from, and it's not always certain how it's going to manifest. And it doesn't always lead to HLH, but for me it did. And yeah, it put me on life support, and I rapidly started to decline. And we got into a very hairy situation where I was on life support for 5 weeks. So, to really paint that picture, I'm on a ventilator, tube down my throat first. I'm unconscious because they had to sedate me, and adjust my level of sedation. But before I was sedated, I was delirious because my systems were failing. Some of the drugs they started to give me made me paranoid. So it was really scary for my wife, who was with me most of the time, to see, in her words, like her big, strong husband who, weighed just under 200 pounds and, power lifted and all that, suddenly seemed so weak and vulnerable in all of this. So eventually landing on these life support systems, becoming, sedated, effectively kind of in a comatose state, on dialysis. I needed that for, I believe, a couple of weeks. And through this, they began the treatment of chemotherapy and the other things. But I was so weakened in that state that they couldn't give me even close to the full dose of chemo as per the treatment protocol. They had to play it day by day and sometimes hour by hour on what I could handle. And while on life support, because I'm unconscious, I can't eat or drink or speak. So I had an NG tube, a nasogastric tube, through my nose down to my stomach, mostly for medications. I was so sick and my body was so tumultuous that I couldn't receive much nutrition. So I went into the hospital weighing about 193 pounds. And 5 weeks later, when I came off of life support, I weighed about 150. So because I couldn't eat, my body needed some sort of energy substrate to exist. And, I didn't go in particular with a lot of fat on me. So the muscle that I had built over all these years, starting to lift for football and then continuing after football and then for bodybuilding and then for powerlifting, you said it exactly right. I had no idea that I was going to need this. I don't think anybody ever plans on it, but I needed that to survive. And the multiple doctors had told me afterwards that unless I had gone into the ICU as fit as I was, like, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I would not have made it. So yeah, it was pretty harrowing. We'll talk probably more about how the experience was on the other side, starting to wake up and starting to realize what the journey ahead of me was going to be. But yeah, all the muscle that I lost, my body used to stay alive. We actually went through all of the treatment options, and even through the chemo, through the corticosteroids, and monoclonal antibodies was the last treatment option that we hadn't tried yet. They administered it, and I continued to get worse afterwards. So there was a point where my hematologist, who was lead on the team, took my parents aside and said, like, his body's going to do what it's going to do. And she was preparing my parents to bury me, because it was going to be that week that I either made it or I didn't. And one of the nurses, the charge nurse, came over after, and she said, it's important that you understand what she just said, the hematologist. It's like, there's nothing else we can do. And, faith plays a pretty big role in my family's life and mine. So the turnaround that I made after that was enough to earn me the nickname Miracle Man, because by all accounts, for the people who were working with me by my bedside, doctors and nurses, I had no business making the recovery that I did. And yet, miraculously, I have. And yeah, after 5 weeks on life support, they started to lower my sedation. They took me off the ventilator, which I forgot to mention. It started down my throat, but they only leave that down the throat for a certain period of time for fear of complications. So they did a tracheotomy, and there's still a small scar on my windpipe from where they had to connect me to the ventilator. So they took me off the ventilator. I had a little tube out my throat, which I then had to learn to use to speak again afterwards. They gradually let me regain consciousness, and I wake up in what feels like somebody else's body because I'm 40 pounds lighter. I'm weak. I'm too weak to get up out of bed or even really to move myself in bed at this point. Um, my left arm, I don't know how well it's going to show here, but I have a skin graft on there now because one of the IVs, I had IVs pretty well at every square inch of skin, it felt like. But one of them malfunctioned. So the medicine, which I think was an antibiotic, didn't go intravenous. It stayed in the skin. It turned all the skin in the back of my hand and back of my distal forearm first yellow, and then it became necrotic. So it was like black and leathery and stuff. So it felt like someone had taken my hand. I was bedbound, and all of my hair had fallen out from the chemo, and it really felt like somebody else's body. So, that was kind of the, what would you even call it? That was the point where I started to understand the situation, that I had made it through the worst at that point, but there was a really, really long road to coming back from there.
Yeah, and I think for the people listening, just to get an idea of what that actually looks like, they can check out your profile and be all inspired. Because one thing is to talk about it, to say I weighed almost 200 pounds and then 40 pounds lighter. But other very different is to actually look at how your body look like how your expression, your facial expression, how was actually being in the hospital. That can paint a really important impression, at least it did for me, because first I listened to your story, and thanks again for sharing it. But to actually use your eyes to gaze into that whole process, it's a whole different story, man. And that's you already alluded to, but I wanted to ask you, when did you realize, when did you gain conscience of, okay, I am here, this is the situation, and how impressive was it? Because in social media, it's so easy to share about, Stoic philosophy
Mm-hmm.
and to speak about the hard times, and it's you're guaranteed to get your like, but a
Yeah.
whole different story is to actually be in a as hard as a situation as yours and to actually take action. Did you mm, gain strength from your family, from your faith, or what did you actually think about to make the conscious decision to let's get into this? Because not being able to speak, not being able to eat, man, that's not that's not something to take lightly.
No, no. And uh, yeah, what it was like. So I have recollections of dreams. They felt like dreams during the ICU, which, as near as I can figure, it was my brain trying to process what was going on, the interplay between how sick my body was and what was going on here, the drugs I was on, who I was hearing in the room. So, like, the dreams, they're wild, man. Like, I dreamt that I was part of a family of whales. I dreamt that I was being kidnapped and taken to a circus because I mentioned the paranoia, both when I was before sedation and then also afterwards. But I had ripped out my tubes at least twice, so they had to restrain me and like to the bed. So I remember a dream about being restrained, and that was very distressing. So as we get to this point, this would have been late February of 2023, where they start to reduce the sedation. I'm starting to come to. I don't remember whether it was my wife or my parents, but they, God bless them, my parents dropped everything and came running, and my parents and my wife kind of alternated shifts at the hospital. So I usually had somebody there with me, or most of the time. Um, so it was, to say it was surreal is an understatement. Uh, I was absolutely devastated, first of all, and pretty immediately my thought goes to my wife and my children, because I've been the sole income earner at home for a long time. I'm self-employed, so if I'm not working, bad things happen. Um, you know, we were overwhelmed with generosity from people, both with their time to help take care of my daughters while my wife was here at the hospital, and then also people bringing food so my family had something to eat. Didn't have to worry about it. People donated money so that those could get paid while I was sick. That helped put my mind at ease at first, which I think really gave me bandwidth to then understand how low on the functional ladder I was starting, where I could not reposition myself in bed, where if I slipped down, as often happens in hospital beds, if anybody's not been in one for a long period of time, you slip down over time. I had to rely on people, the nurses primarily, to lift me back up. I couldn't get out of bed to go to the bathroom. I was catheterized for one, but I couldn't get out of bed. So I needed a mechanical lift on the ceiling. They had to roll me onto this harness and then connect the harness and move me. It was a whole thing. It was like a 5 to 10 minute process just to get to the chair that was next to the bed, and another 5 to 10 minute process to come back. And I couldn't speak, like we mentioned. My vision was more affected than it normally was. Because again, I've got ongoing eye issues, but everything was dim and blurry. I couldn't communicate the way I wanted to. I couldn't write because I also had an intention tremor where every time I tried to move my hand, it would shake like this. It would stay. It wouldn't shake if I was at rest, but if I was trying to move or do something, the tremor would kick in, and that was more of a central nervous system issue as things were settling. So I was I was absolutely devastated. I was anxious about my family. I was angry about the situation. I was pissed off, like, why me? Why did this happen? There was no indication before this that this was going to be the case. And now I suddenly have all of this loss of identity, loss of ability, loss of function, loss of time, because I was still in the ICU, off of life support, but in the ICU when my wife's birthday happened. And I was pissed off that I couldn't do something special for her and celebrate her birthday. And she was suddenly a single mom overnight, and all of this. So you're 100% right. Like, I love stoicism as much as the next guy, and it still plays in, to the rest of the story. I was far from stoic, and I think I needed to be. I remember times, because as you'd expect, there were lots and lots of tests ongoing in the ICU and in the other units that I stayed in until I was discharged. But I remember one of the tests was going to the speech language pathologists so they could do this dynamic x-ray to see how my throat muscles were working. Because since they had all atrophied from not eating and drinking or speaking for 5 weeks, and then from the trach, I couldn't eat or drink anything by mouth, or I ran the risk of choking and aspirating. So I was doing rehab of like chewing ice chips and working on learning to swallow, which is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
For me. I think for anybody who's never had to consider that, but because we obviously eat and drink all the time normally, but things atrophy in your larynx and your anywhere in the body if you don't use it, same as anything else. So that was just a total paradigm shift. Like, I have to rehab by eating these gosh darn ice chips, and I had to pass a test to be able to eat and drink, and I failed that test the first time through. So I'm lying on this hospital stretcher with my wife next to me, waiting for someone to take me back to my room, and just in tears because I just wanted to fucking eat. Sorry, I don't know if you swear on this, but
Oh, please go ahead, man.
awesome.
Of course, you're allowed.
Great. So lots of moments like that with anger, with grief, with sadness. And at the same time, I'm so grateful for it. Lots of moments of compassion from my wife, from my parents, and I'll forever be thankful for them for that. But also from the nurses and doctors. I remember one of the doctors, any doctor has a million things to do, especially one in the hospital, especially one in the ICU. One of the doctors stayed with me by my bedside and just held my hand as I cried one day for a few minutes. So that sort of comfort, compassion, I was so grateful for, and I still am, because it gave me the space to process the loss enough in that moment to then make the decisions necessary to say, okay, I have a really long road back from here, but I'm still breathing. I still have a chance to get out of the hospital, to get back to my wife and to my daughters. And that was the decision. It wasn't so simple as in I made the decision one day and everything else was smooth sailing. There were some really hard days. I often had to make that decision again every hour. Excuse me, just because of all the things going on. But I knew that if I had a chance, I was going to take it. And one thing that I'm really good at is being really stubborn. You know, it can be a fault sometimes, but I'm a recovering type A perfectionist, oldest kid of 5, so I've got oldest child syndrome, but I know how to work hard, which helped me in this situation, as did my background in sports and in training and physical therapy and rehabilitation, because I knew things that told me this was possible, but I also knew enough to make it more difficult, because I understood how grave the situation was, or how difficult it was going to be, and how long this process was going to be. So it was a double-edged sword. But even with that, we started the rehab process with those ice chips, with learning bed exercises and learning to stand again with other physios in the ICU. And we built our way over time. And yeah, it wasn't easy, but made it through.
Man, I'm smiling because that's fucking beautiful. As a testament to what one can do by an active decision, and not just one decision, like you mentioned that I'm gonna do this. Hell no, man. It's like every second, every hour, you have to again and again decide that you're actually gonna do that and do it. So the thing that my mind cannot really process is how can you go from rehab for reading, for speaking, to actually training for a competition, correct me if I'm wrong, 1 year later. I mean, how does that even work, man? Because in the fitness world, in the lifting world, when we have aches and pains and perhaps an injury, it's like, unfortunately, the common practice here, at least in Mexico, is that if that somebody gets injured, you don't have to train because you're gonna injure yourself further and
Right.
stupid stuff like this.
Mhm.
But man, hearing your story, I actually shared your story with my mom because she's going through some rough things about pain and everything. And mom, please look at this. Please let me know what you think. I'm gonna talk to Jared. I hope you can listen, and I hope she listens to it.
Yeah.
I can even process it, man. How can you go from not being able to even eat to actually lifting and to actually train for a competition, not just lifting, not just getting under the bar, but to compete? How does that even work, man?
Yeah, it's it's even kind of surprising to look back, being the one who went through that, but looking back at it in retrospect, because you're right. The timeline was I went into the hospital January 23rd of 2023, hospital or ICU 6 days later, in the ICU on life support for 5 weeks, and then left the hospital in total May 1st of 2023. Now, when I say left the hospital, I wasn't good. I was still bedbound, but I was just bedbound at home. Um, but May 1st, it took me another month, into early June of 2023 to even work up the stamina and the readiness to walk down to my main floor and then to my basement where I am now. I have a gym here, but I had to learn how to walk. It's another thing I didn't mention, but obviously like learn to stand and then using a lot of assistance and a walker and then a cane. So it took me a month to even get down here. But the rehab process, it really started with just, it was sitting on the bedside and like learning how to control my trunk and sway from side to side. It started with sitting up in a chair, which we do that all day long. I'm doing it now. You are too, probably. When you've been lying down for 5 weeks and everything's atrophied and you are as skeletal as I was, sitting up in a chair is difficult. And I could only do that for about 10, 15 minutes at first, and then 30. So I had to gradually expose myself to more time in the chair. It was progressive overload for sitting, of all things. But that's where I had to be. And then it was more progressive exposure to walking further and further distances with less and less support. I went from a big platform walker to one of the rolling walkers that many of us have seen, then to a cane, and worked on distances, worked on walking up and down stairs with assistance. Other resistance exercises were like using a soup can or like a 1 pound weight. I mean, you think about, we like to joke, especially in the fitness or rehab world, about, oh, you're going to take your 2 pound weights and do your exercises. And like, yeah, that's what I had to do because that's all I could manage. And it was aided by something that I knew of in the research, which is once you've reached a certain level of condition, be it a certain level of fitness, it also works for fat tissue or adiposity. It's easier to get back to that same point than it was to get there in the first place, which is why it's difficult for many people who have been overweight or obese, in many instances, to keep the weight off because the adipose cells still exist. It's easier to get back there. In this case, it was easier for me at a certain point to regain some of that lost muscle. And the point where that really seemed to accelerate and feel easier was when I was back home. I was able to get back in the gym, and this would have been like early July, where I could finally start to hold on to a barbell again. So empty barbell, limited range of motion, Romanian deadlifts, because I'm still really, really deconditioned. I weighed about 160 pounds maybe at the time. I had a lot of nerve pain. I had contractures. I couldn't fully extend my hips. I had odd swelling and open wounds. That was another thing that came up through the hospital that had to be managed. So I was very limited still in what I could do. But once I could hold on to a barbell again, I think expose myself to enough of that stimulus, excuse me, while also pairing that with being able to consume enough food, which was a challenge because I had to learn how to swallow safely again. Then I had to manage the nausea and the vomiting that came from the chemotherapy, and eventually work up to like consuming enough calories to aid the recovery process and start to build more muscle tissue. Once we kind of hit that critical mass, no pun intended, then it felt like my body was like, oh, okay, yeah, we like muscle. We can start building some of this stuff back. And it was, that point was early to mid-July. Sometime in September, I looked at myself in the mirror after an upper body day, and I started to see some muscle definition coming through. I still weighed about 165, 168 pounds, but was starting to head in that right direction. I didn't decide on competing then and there. I made a conscious choice to avoid setting number goals or competition goals until I was further along. The main goal for me at the start for a long time was just consistency. Show up, get the workouts done. Got back to training 4 days a week. And, Also had hiccups because I got pneumonia in October, November. One of the things that happens after chemo, as many of us are aware, is that you're immunocompromised. And I got really sick. Um, I needed about 2 or 3 courses of antibiotics to be okay, but that set me back a number of weeks for training. Had to build momentum again. But in February of this year, 2024, that's where, training was regular enough again, where I thought I can start looking at meets. No expectation for numbers, just I'd like to get back and compete again. So I thought, May seems like a good time frame, which would have been 1 year removed from being discharged from the hospital. So found a meet. It was May 25th, if memory serves, of this year. And my business partner John, as well as one of our coaches, David, they were the ones in charge of my training. Dave took control in the early days, even fresh out of the hospital, which I'm very grateful for. But we shifted gears, prepped for the meet, and it ended up being the case where I weighed in lighter than expected. I weighed in at 82.3 kilos body weight. This was a 24-hour weigh-in. I've competed in both 2 hour and 24. It was just the meat that was available, and went 9 for 9 on the day. I think I squatted 380, around 380. I benched, I want to say 245, or in that ballpark again, and I deadlifted 501. And the 501 deadlift was a lifetime PR, and my DOTS coefficient was also a lifetime PR there. So it was incredible, and I went into that meet having an idea of what the numbers were because we based it off of training data, and this was my 4th personal competition, and I've been around the sport for a long time. So I had a good idea of what was going to come around, but I went into the meet just wanting to have fun and being grateful that I got to, because none of that was guaranteed. There was, especially knowing, what we had been through less than or up to a year before. This was just fun, and gratitude flowed through the whole day for me. I wanted to do well, but I wasn't attached to the outcome, and that felt like the exact right place for me to be, which led to a 9 for 9 day with more in the tank, and really what felt like a win for everybody who played a role in helping me get there. The medical staff, I encountered so many incredible people who were not only skilled and competent, but also like compassionate. My family, my wife, my parents, my daughters, they were, that was the first powerlifting meet they had seen me compete at, and they were in the crowd. The announcer took the mic and put it in front of my daughter's faces. So I'm setting up for my squat, and I hear, "Go, Dad! Go,
Oh man,
Dad!" So you want motivation? That's a good pre-workout right there. Um, them, my friends, my colleagues, John, Dave, who stepped it up incredibly behind the scenes to take care of the clients who I couldn't serve for a long period of time. They still made sure clients were taken care of. Um, so it was meaningful. It's still kind of surreal. That's how it went down.
I don't even know where to begin, man. I think based on all this story, there are some major and super interesting points that I just wanted to highlight. And one that you mentioned is the role of compassion
Mhm.
from the personnel at the hospital, the role of compassion to yourself, and also acceptance, because you were capable, maybe conscious or maybe just as an instinctive behavior, I don't know, to actually accept the situation and act upon it. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, because hell, how can that be easy, right?
Exactly.
But to actually accept and not dwell on the sadness of itself and the hardships that you had to face, to me, that's one of the major aspects that I can learn and people can learn from your story. And to actually train and not be afraid of training, that you're not going to break from the barbell, that it's that very same barbell that prior help you survive the whole
Yeah.
process, and after, to actually make you strong. And not strong, but stronger than you were prior to the whole experience. So that's what I think it's the most, man, I don't know how to even put it into words. Let's say things that you can learn not for your practice, not from a live stream on Instagram, but for your life, man. And that's why I'm so grateful that I got to know about your story, about your you as a person, you as a coach, your practice, and how can we implement not only your experience, but all these things into our training, into the way we view our particular training, and also our clients with, like I mentioned, compassion, progressive overload, because it's not something that you need to fight. It's something, the way I see it, something you receive based on your on the things you do, and to just keep going, man. I don't know how to put it into words, but I'm so grateful to get to chat to you.
Thank you, man. It really means a lot, Daniel. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this because, I mean, yeah, it, it's even as I've had this time to this much time to reflect on the journey, which is still unfolding because medically I'm stable now. There's ongoing challenges and degradation with my eyes for the unrelated condition. So the challenges continue. And I I'm grateful. Gratitude continues to be the theme for me, where I've learned from incredible people. I have incredible people around me in my personal life and professional life. Um, you know, privilege is another word that comes up, where I was able and I am able to continue to choose to move forward. And I had to, because of necessity, uh, show myself that I was tougher or more resilient than I probably would have ever thought before. Um, and also, in this extreme example, which I hope nobody has to go through, I know HLH cases exist. I know other rare and not rare diseases exist, and people unfortunately have to go through them. Um, and whether you're one of them or you're not, we we know from the research that fitness, strength, building muscle, making yourself as fit as you can pays dividends down the road. For me, I discovered that all of the training and the muscle that I built was a life insurance policy I didn't know I was going to need to cash in on, but I did. And, you know, I look at other examples like my wife, as she has gotten stronger to take care of our children and keep up with them as they grow, and then have to do that in the midst of the stress of her husband, you know, falling ill and possibly dying in the or possibly dying there, not coming back. The resilience that you don't plan on needing, but when you need it, you really hope you have enough of it. So the actions that we take now, you know, how we choose to nourish ourselves, whether it's in the food that we eat, the things that we spend our mental energy thinking about, our physical practices, all of these things help build us up so that when the storm hits, you know, we have more of an ability to make it through. And if I can be some way that that message gets out better or more, or it hits home for somebody and encourages them through their own difficulty or trials, whatever it is right now, that's worth it to me. And if it can help to, you know, encourage people to take those actions in case they need it down the road, uh, that seems like a good deal. So
Oh, it
I'm
is, man. You
grateful.
can be sure of that. You can be sure of that. It's doing it. It did it for me. It does it every day. I get your story present in my day-to-day basis. And I hope this live stream, and also like I already mentioned, I'll be uploading to YouTube so people can watch it, can have this super valuable resource. So my madman Jared, I don't know how you did manage all this craziness. It's so nice to hear about these stories, and also a big shout out to your family, to all the people that's been with you, around you. No easy task. So I just want to thank you once again for taking the time to meet. It's been a huge privilege, an honor, and hopefully we can dig into more nuanced topics about training and research and all this nerdy stuff that we love sometime soon. So, my man, I don't want to take any more of your time, so cannot thank you
Thank
enough.
you, Daniel. The thanks is mutual. Absolutely. I was gonna say if I'd love to dig into more nerdy stuff, and we have to include Tony Hawk's Pro Skater now
Oh,
since
for
we
sure,
both
man. For sure,
are,
man.
are skaters.
So I hope you have a great rest of the day, man. Maybe we can. Well, I don't know if you play Tony Hawk on the N64 of the PlayStation. For me, it was the N64. So maybe one day we can get a little bit jamming on the Tony Hawk.
I love it. I played it on the PlayStation, but we'll find a way to make this
Ah,
happen. We have to
for
now.
real, man. For real, man. Jared, hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you, man. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Daniel. Thank you.